So first again, just thank you for extending this opportunity to me. And I'm just gonna, do my best and let the Holy Spirit do the rest. So today we are continuing with her story, characteristics of a Shero. And today's Shero is Deborah. Our text is taken from Judges chapter 4, verses 4 through 14, and chapter 5, verses 7 through 9. And so what I want to do before we get into Deborah's specific story is I want to give an overview of the book of Judges. And so I have this resource from the Bible Project. So let's just check this out really quickly.
The book of Judges. So remember, after Joshua led the tribes of Israel into the promised land, he called them to be faithful to their covenant with God by obeying the commands of the Torah. And if they do this, they will show all the other nations what God is like. So Judges begins with the death of Joshua and basically tells the story of Israel's total failure. The book's name comes from the type of leaders Israel had in this period. Before they had any kings, the tribes were all governed by these judges. Now, don't think of a courtroom. These were regional political military leaders, more like a tribal chieftain. And you need to be warned, the book of Judges is very disturbing and violent. It tells the tragic tale of Israel's moral corruption, of its bad leadership, and basically how they become no different than the Canaanites. But this sad story is also meant to generate hope for the future, and you can see this in how the book's designed. There's a large introduction that sets the stage for Israel's failure as they don't drive out the remaining Canaanites. Then the large main section of the book has stories about the growing corruption of Israel's judges, and the progression here shows how Israel's leaders go from pretty good to okay to bad to worse. The concluding section is really disturbing and shows the corruption of the people of Israel as a whole. So let's dive in and we can explore each part a bit more. The opening section begins with the tribes of Israel in their territories in the Promised Land. And while Joshua defeated some key Canaanite towns, there was still a lot of land to be taken and lots of Canaanites living in those areas. And so chapter 1 gives a long list of Canaanite groups and towns that Israel just failed to drive out from the land. Now, remember, the whole point of driving out the Canaanites was to avoid their moral corruption and their way of worshiping the gods through child sacrifice. God had called Israel to be a holy people, and that does not happen. Chapter 2 describes how Israel just moved in alongside the Canaanites and adopted all their cultural and religious practices. And it's right here that the story stops. For nearly a whole chapter, the narrator gives us an overview of everything that's about to happen in the body of the book. This part of Israel's history, the narrator says, was a series of cycles moving in a downward spiral. So Israel became like the Canaanites, and so they would sin against God. So God would allow them to be conquered and oppressed by the Canaanites, and eventually the Israelites would see the error of their ways and repent. So God would raise up a deliverer, a judge from among Israel who would defeat the enemy and bring about an era of peace. But eventually Israel would sin again, and it would all start over. This cycle provides the literary design and flow for the next main section of the book. It gets repeated for each of the 6 main judges whose stories are told here. Now, the stories of the first 3 judges, Othniel, Ehud, and Deborah, they are epic adventures. They're also extremely bloody stories. Either the judge themselves or people who help the judge, they defeat their enemies and deliver the people of Israel.
All right, so that's just an overview, cutting off where we get started with our character, our protagonist. And so one thing that I want to do as well before we get into it is just revisit God's purpose for judges. So in Judges chapter 2, verse 18, it says that when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. And so that was Deborah's overall purpose. A fun fact, Deborah was the only woman chosen by God to be a judge over Israel. I've got a question for y'all. How many judges can you name besides Deborah? You should know a few because they mentioned it in the video. You could either unmute or you could drop it in the chat. I see Gideon in the chat. Barak, Samson. 10 more seconds. Lois, okay. Samuel, Ehud. Y'all are Googling, I feel it. All right, at the buzzer, boom, there we are. So here are those judges. There we go. So next time someone asks you that, you'll be ready. Bible quiz bowl or something. So now another visual overview of Judges chapter 4, verse 4 through 14. And then we're going to look at specific verses and break those down.
Although the children of Israel had conquered much of the land, the Canaanites oppressed them, and the general Sisera continued to march forward. No one person had taken it upon themselves to defeat Sisera. For who could? Not just any random citizen.
Who are you calling random?
But could a general? Or a prophet?
Barak,
What is it this time?
you must take 10,000 men to the Kishon River, where you will find Sisera and his army. God will deliver him into your hands.
Sisera. Have you seen his army? Iron chariots. What do we have compared to that?
God,
Okay. We'll go. But only if you come with us.
I'll come along, but know this, the victory will not belong to you. People will say that a woman defeated Sisera. Rise! This is the day that God gives Sisera into your hands.
Every last one of the Canaanites was destroyed, except one.
I gotta get out of here.
All right, so that's the visual representation, a visual summary of Judges 4, verses 4 through 14. And now we're going to look at specific verses and break this down and see what is it that makes Deborah a Shero. And so in Judges chapter 4, verse 3 through 4, it says, it gives us a backstory. As it was mentioned in the first video, Israel is going through this cycle of disobedience, doing what they want to do, having big fun. And then they get oppressed and then they cry out to the Lord. And so as we know, the Lord said, if my people would turn away from their sin, cry out, etc., then he would, help them. And so that is what happens in this cycle. And then we want to highlight what happens with Deborah. So in verse 4, it says, now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. And so from verse 4, we learned three things about Deborah. First is that we learned that she was a prophetess. And so what does this mean? She delivered messages from God to mankind. She was God's mouthpiece. And so this is unique in the sense that, again, she was the only female judge in a tradition in which men were in positions of power and leadership. So she was chosen as God's mouthpiece for a reason. We also learned that she was a wife. Now, the specifics of this is kind of unclear. There's debate as to what wife means in this context, because the Hebrew word or the same word is used for woman, just in general, and wife. So either she was a married woman or she was just a woman. She was either a woman who lived in a place called Lapidoth, or she was the wife of a man named Lapidoth. And we also find out that she was a judge. So this is a position of power in the Israelite kingdom and in God's kingdom as well. She had the ability to settle civil disputes, but she also has some military powers as well. And she helped in the governing of Israel. When we get to verse 5, it says that her courtroom, so to speak, was under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the mountains of Ephraim, and the sons of Israel went up to her for judgment. So they came to her, she didn't go to them. Verse 6 continues and says that she, in this place where she was, she sent and called for Barak, the son of Abinoam from Kadesh and Naphtali, and said to him, has not the Lord God of Israel commanded, go and deploy the troops at Mount Tabor. Take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and sons of Zebulun. And against you I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his multitude at the river Kishon, and I will deliver him into your hand. So from this verse 6, let me give you the visual first. So here is the visual. Down in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see where Deborah's court was held. So in between Bethel and Ramah. And just a fun fact about palm trees, it says that she sits under the palm tree. So a palm tree is symbolic of uprightness or maybe righteousness, also of fruitfulness, resilience, and victory. And that was her place. Up a little toward the top of your image, you'll see the place in which she prophesied was the place of Israel's victory. So she delivered the message from God to Barak to go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor. So from those verses, we find out some more things about Deborah. We find out that she had a place. Her place was under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel. She had a purpose. She had two purposes, or maybe that's one purpose, just multiple layers. So she was a judge, so she helped to establish justice and the practice of law amongst the Israelites. But she was also a prophet. So in her judging and in her role as a prophet, she helped to rescue the Israelites from their enemies by giving those prophecies and redirecting them back to God. And continuing, she had a prophecy as well. What was the prophecy in this particular text? Was that Barak and his army would defeat Sisera, and Israel would have the victory. They would have eliminated one of their oppressors. When we look at verses 8 through 10, Barak says, if you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. Deborah confidently says, I will certainly go with you. However, the fame shall not be yours on the journey that you are about to take, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. So another woman enters into the scene. Then Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh. The excerpt continues by saying that Barak summons who he's supposed to summon, and Deborah went up with him. So the original prophecy changed because of Barak's shaky faith or confidence, whether that was in God and himself or one or the other. Whatever the case was, the prophecy changed. And so God would ultimately get the glory in the original prophecy, but there would have been some glory for Barak as well. But again, because he had shaky faith and confidence, and maybe he was fearful of Jabin's iron chariots, the prophecy changed, the outcome changed a little bit. And so Deborah, though, her confidence wasn't shaken. She still had faith in God. She still had faith in who she was in this particular verse and in other verses. She went up with him. She wasn't forced. She wasn't coerced. She chose to go up with him. And verses 11 through 13, paraphrase, yes, so her faith of others. And so what God said would happen, happened, as it always does. So verse 6 says, or referring back to verse 6, ultimately, right, God delivered the army into his hand. And so this is a map of that particular encounter that they had, where they met. So the blue line is the Israelites coming from Mount Tabor, and the red line is from Sisera's army. And this was their meeting point. And if you read further into the chapter, we see what happens. I'm not sure if someone is teaching from that text later on, so I don't want to go too much into it. And so when we jump from there to Judges chapter 5, verse 7 through 9, we'll see what the end result is. Okay, so Christina said next week. Cool. I'm glad I didn't go into that. So we'll just look at this last part though to see what happens toward the end.
Sisera had been delivered to Barak through the hands of a woman. With Sisera gone, God, king of all of Canaan, had to surrender before the little nation of Israel. After that, Deborah and Barak burst into song, praised God, and celebrated how God had saved his family. And then there was peace for 40 years. And that's the story of Deborah. So in case you missed it, here's the quick version.
I'm going to pause that because the quick version goes into another part and I don't want to steal anybody's thunder. What are some of the takeaways? One, Deborah had a place, and she had a place, a purpose, a prophecy. She had power and she had praise. And so her place was under the tree of Deborah between Bethel and Ramah. And she, in that place, operated in her purpose, which was as a prophetess, but also as a judge. And so as a prophetess, she had a specific prophecy that she delivered to Barak. And so her being a woman in this society, the fact that she was a judge, the fact that she was a prophetess, and this is like, pre-Jesus. And so she had some power in society, and she exercised that power with confidence, with grace, confidence in herself, confidence in God first and foremost. And she trusted what the Lord said. She stood on that 10 toes down. And because of her faith, her confidence in God, she was able to lead others toward victory. And that praise, that victory led to praise. And she led others into praise. So she led them through battle, but she also led them in praise. And so all in all, we find some more things that we could take away from this story. So Deborah was that B-E-E, and she was confident in God first and in who she was in God. The reason why I say that Deborah was that B-E-E is because her name literally means bee. And so there are some characteristics of a bee that Deborah exhibited in this particular story. Community service, she exercised that in her role as a judge and as a prophet. Focus, so she was focused on what her task, her God-given task was, to prophesy and to judge. And even though in a way she was taken from her place and her purpose serving under that tree, she still was operating in that. So even though she had to change her location from under that tree, that palm tree, and to move to actually the battlefield, which takes some confidence in and of itself because she's a woman on a battlefield, which is not a usual place for a woman during these times. So she was still focused on her God-given task. She was dedicated as well, like bees are, to the God-given task. She worked hard, she was resilient, and she incorporated those aspects of teamwork. And all in all, right, she wasn't worried about what other people said. She wasn't worried about going with Barak, being on the battlefield and possibly being killed, because she knew what God told her. She knew that the victory would be there, and God would get the victory, God would get the glory. And so I hope that you leave with that in mind, right? That whatever God gives you to do, wherever God places you, if you said it, believe it, he'll take you through it, he'll help you get the victory. So be like Deborah, be that B-E-E, and be confident in God first and in who he says you are and what you can do. And that's it. Thank you.